Good morning. Welcome to Expanded Learning, Governance for Developing Effective Learning Recovery Plans. This is the second webinar in our two-part series on how governance teams can approach the development of your plans in learning recovery, including mental health supports using state and federal relief funding. In our first webinar, we discussed effective summer learning programs and heard from several trustees about their plans to re-engage students and address the disparities exacerbated by the pandemic. Today, you're going to hear from a panel of researchers, superintendents, and school board members about how local educational agencies can draw upon state relief funding to address the disruptions of the past year and support systemic transformation for our students so they can thrive academically and emotionally. At CSBA, we know you've had to contend with ever-changing public health conditions and guidance, and we know how challenging it is to develop strategic, much less coherent plans to meet the needs of students in this context. I'm reminded a lot of the iconic scene from I Love Lucy, in which there was a conveyor belt of chocolates that kept accelerating as Lucy and Ethel tried to keep up. That's how it's felt a little bit in terms of all of the information and guidance that we've received in the past year, except for the stakes are much higher. And for board members, it's important to understand how you can use your position to support staff, families, and the students you serve. But fortunately, you're not alone in this work. And it begins with being informed about the options available to your LEA and what practices have a strong evidence base. We hope that today's webinar provides a useful framework for the summer and the years ahead, not to mention practical guidance and a sense of how your colleagues across the state are starting to tackle this work. But before we begin, a few housekeeping items. If you are not familiar with the GoToWebinar platform, which we are using, just wanted to let you know a few features that you can use to submit questions for the Q&A. So today we're going to hear from a few researchers, get a little bit of the local perspective from some superintendents and trustees. And at the end of the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A. We have several questions already submitted at the time of registration, and you will have the opportunity to submit questions during today's webinar. We'll try to get to as many as possible. You'll type your questions into the questions tab of the dashboard that's on the right side of your screen. If you don't see that dashboard now, it might be collapsed. So look for a little orange arrow on the side, top right corner of your screen, and you'd click on that arrow to expand the dashboard. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our illustrious panel. Today we have Heather Huff from Policy Analysis for California Education. She's the Executive Director based out of Stanford. Kelsey Krausen is the Senior Engagement Manager at West Ed. Jeff Harris is Superintendent for Dell North County USD. Jeff Puglisi, Dr. John Puglisi is Superintendent of Rio SD. Robert Garcia, Trustee from Jurupa USD. David Rivera, the Assistant Superintendent of Business Services from Orange USD. And Paul Wallace, Trustee from Newman Crows Landing. I'll be your moderator today, but I'd like to begin by introducing Heather, who will share a framework for how we think about bringing students back.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks to everyone for having me and letting me speak with you today about both the incredible opportunity that we have ahead and some of the research-based practices that can help our schools and districts meet an incredibly unprecedented need that we have in the system. Next slide, actually 2 slides. So I want to start with just providing a little bit of an overview about the problem that we have to solve and the opportunity ahead. So I think that it's well understood at this point that COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on families and students and communities as a whole. But I want to talk for just a minute about what that looks like. We know that students have fallen behind academically. We also know that they've been disengaged from school, that mental health and physical health and wellness are suffering. We know that this is true for all students across the state, but that particular students have borne the brunt of these effects. That's true for students with disabilities, students learning English, Black, Latinx, Asian, young students, low-income students, and the list goes on. But the effect has not been consistently spread across the state. And part of that is because of the different effects of the pandemic itself, but also differential access to high quality distance learning, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that we need to address that high level of need, but the disruption in the status quo has also presented an opportunity. Our systems were not well structured to serve all kids even before the pandemic. And now we've had both a break in that status quo, but also so much innovation at the local level that we can take advantage of in thinking about the path forward. And finally, we have an unprecedented amount of state and federal funding that enables us to double down on some of these innovative practices and continue to try new things that are better served at meeting the needs of our students. So this lays out two critical issues with this new state and federal funding. The first is, how can we spend this money to act now to address critical needs? Students need things right when they walk in the door in the fall or in the summer for districts that are offering summer programs, but how do we use those investments to lay the groundwork for longer term transformation? Next slide. So in partnership with over 40 organizations across California, PACE has been working over the last few months to establish consensus around what those research-based practices should be, building from a place that we know our number one goal in education is to educate students. We know that we need to accelerate learning and we need to address those learning needs. But through a large and growing body of research, we know that the way to address student learning is not through focusing on academic content exclusively, but really engaging with the whole child, making sure that we focus on relationships and student well-being as a way to accelerate that learning. So I'm going to share at a high level our 5-part framework, and we're going to focus in on parts 2, 3, and 4 in the rest of my presentation. But just quickly, the reemergence into school has to start with the centering of relationships. Students have been out of relationship with school and school-based folks for a really long time now. So making intentional time and space for students to develop those relationships with each other and their teachers, for staff to re-engage with each other as well. But I think even more critically is developing and strengthening relationships with families. Families have taken a really different role during the pandemic in educating their children than they ever have in the past. So bringing them into the process of recovery is critical. We also need to make sure then that we're assessing child's needs, every child's needs, so that we know what to put into place to serve them better. We need to make a very deliberate focus on making all instruction learning relevant and rigorous. And then this is a critical role for school boards. We need systems and teams in place at the school level and at the district level to be empowered to reimagine their systems and to engage in an iterative process of really evaluating what works and for which students and under which conditions, which will be a critical aspect of knowing what to keep at the end of this recovery period as we move into our longer term system. Next slide. So as we think about these investments, there's 2 distinct periods that we want folks to be considering. The first is a restorative restart, the first 6 weeks of school, having a very constrained time period where we say, what are all of the things that we need to get into place so that when students and educators enter school buildings, they have an intensive focus on being part of the school community and laying the groundwork for the rest of the year. But in the months and years that follow, we should already now be thinking about how those investments are going to be continued and strengthened and systematized so that this infusion of money and this opportunity is something that really does lead to that longer term transformation. Next slide. So I'm going to drill down on 3 aspects that are specific to learning recovery. The first is assessing student needs, and everything that follows in the school year has to start with a real authentic assessment of student need across all dimensions. So what this means is in the first weeks of school, when students are back in person, every school and district needs to conduct regular student wellness screenings, needs to utilize interim or diagnostic assessments to determine current learning needs. What do students need to learn? What have they not learned that they were supposed to learn so that they can get that intervention? We also need to make sure that every school is reviewing prior year data on attendance, engagement, and grades to really understand what they experienced in the past year. And then bring in those conversations with families to discuss both student needs and also assets with parents, caregivers, and former teachers. So the idea, though, is that once you have all of this information, you're thinking about what students need in 3 separate tiers. What's up in the right corner here is multi-tiered systems of supports. The idea behind this is that tier 1 is the baseline of support and instruction that every student gets. But as you move up in the tiers, students get more intensive supports. So thinking about how you're making sure that all students get what they need and that some students get that targeted support. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So important considerations here, schools and districts really need to only collect data that is going to be used. Research has shown that asking students questions, for example, like, do you have a trusted adult in your school? If they say no and then nobody steps in to help, that can actually reinforce feelings of isolation. And similarly, there's a cost to formative assessments. So if people are not going to use that data to inform instruction, then we don't want to take away from instructional time or produce stress within the students that are taking those assessments. Teachers, school leaders, and district administrators also need different kinds of information and data to make decisions. At a classroom level, this is very, very quick and needs to be student specific. But at the district level, you might need something across schools or something that's higher level. And both of those are really important for decision making. And finally, staff may need training and support in reviewing and acting upon data and making sure that they maintain an improvement mindset, meaning that we really want to make sure that data we collect doesn't reinforce biases, or other ways of thinking, well, that student just doesn't engage, right? Like really coming at it like, how can I get that student to engage? Next slide. So once we have all of that information about what students need, we have to have a system that's built to provide targeted supports. So what are some of those supports that are raised up by research evidence and by practice in schools? The first is high dosage tutoring and mentoring is a critical investment that districts can be utilizing in this recovery period. Research has shown that it's very effective at accelerating student learning, but has to be high dosage. So it has to happen more than once per week, ideally more than 3 times per week. And there has to be a relationship that's established between a teacher and their tutor. We also know that students will need mental health and counseling support over the next year, and we should be prepared to offer expanded learning opportunities. This can include summer school, after school time, but in addition to having an academic focus, these programs have to be hands-on, fun and engaging, student-centered, aligned with classroom learning, but not kind of repetitive to classroom learning. And there has to be a deliberate focus on re-engaging students. Some students have been completely disengaged from school over the past year, and getting them to come back might be very high touch, might involve partnering with parents and communities to think about what transportation or clothing or food needs they might have in getting back to school. So important considerations here. We know that these are big people tasks. They're going to involve lots of people in schools, and California schools are notoriously understaffed. We generally have had fewer teachers, fewer nurses, fewer counselors, fewer librarians. So partnering with community-based organizations is going to be critical for most districts in implementing these programs. Another potential staffing option is to hire high school and college age youth, family and community members who can serve as liaisons, mentors, and tutors. Engaging community in this way can be really a critical recovery strategy because it can get money into the community that may have been hard hit by the pandemic. It also can provide linguistic support or ensure that adults or older youth in buildings are more representative of the students that they serve. These new community roles will require training, but they may be easier to staff than highly specialized or credentialed positions. And one potential option is for districts that are in places where they might not have those community roles. There are remote solutions, remote tutoring, remote counseling that can be an option. Next slide. But it's also critical to make sure that all students have that tier 1 engaging grade level content in every single classroom. And so to that end, we need to make sure that racial equity in curriculum and teaching is front and center. Over the past year, because of the pandemic, because of racial injustice that's come to the fore, those issues are top of mind for students, and we need to make sure that that's being reflected in their instruction. We also need to make sure that they have choice and voice in their learning and give them lots of opportunities for both feedback and collaboration. And in every classroom, teachers need to focus on priority standards and lessons that accelerate student learning, but on grade level content. The focus has to be on accelerating, not remediating. So being smart about what do we need to focus on? What can we let go this year in the interest of keeping students on grade level? So because all of that involves professional learning, it will be critical to make sure that good, high quality staff development is put into place. So what do we know from research about that, what that looks like? It's ongoing and it's embedded. It involves time for people to work together during the day. So people learn best when they're working with other people on a regular basis. Also, we know that when local expertise is built up, so when the teachers of professional development are people who are well respected and who have promising practice locally, that sticks more often. And then balancing tight and loose priorities. So what's non-negotiable? What must we see in every classroom? And where does a teacher have flexibility in implementation? That's critical to delineate. So next slide. Finally, as we think about how to invest, and Kelsey will talk a bit more about this in a second, but we've been thinking about 4 buckets that we're calling the 4 T's: time, talent, training, and technology. So thinking about if we have this big goal of a restorative restart, what do we need to allocate in these buckets? In time, this is things like, how do we make sure that teachers have time to collaborate, that district and school site staff have time to plan? How do we make sure that we carve out some time for relationship building? How do we pay teachers and staff to do extra things that go beyond normal responsibilities? There's a lot of people we need to hire. This includes high school and college age youth, counselors, staffing up for our expanded learning opportunities, but I think most critically partnering with community-based partners, providing now the funding and infrastructure for the training that has to happen for existing staff and new staff, and then also allocating funds for purchasing devices, learning management systems, personalized learning platforms, books, all of those things that we know that students will need in order to proceed. So all of these slides and a whole bunch of other resources will be provided to you after this webinar. So I'm not going to go into every line here. And I'm going to pass it over to Kelsey Krausen now, who's going to go much more in depth on thinking about spending and allocation.
Great, thank you, Heather. And thank you, Mary and CSBA. I'm Kelsey Krausen. I'm a Senior Engagement Manager at WestEd. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk a little bit, as Heather mentioned, about the resources that are coming from the federal and state government to support learning acceleration over the course of the next few months and years. So I'm going to talk about the magnitude of the investment, and then about some of the opportunities and challenges that that investment presents to school board members and district leaders, and then some potential strategies for investing those dollars. So first, this chart shows just the size of the investment from the federal government. In March, the Congress passed the American Rescue Plan, which provided $1.9 trillion in COVID relief funding. Here you can see the amount dedicated to children, so from childcare all the way up through higher education, was about $348 billion. And across the different COVID-related funding initiatives, and then $130 billion just most recently for K-12 funding from the American Rescue Plan. And just for comparison's sake, you can see after the Great Recession, the ARA funds, which many of you probably remember, were about $100 billion in funding. So really shows just the size of the investment that the federal government is making in stimulating the economy and getting schools and all of us back on track in the short term, but also investing in longer term structural changes to our systems. Next slide, please. So this chart shows, again, this sort of once in a lifetime public investment and of federal dollars. And on the far right-hand side, you can see the combined sort of stacked bar chart showing funding per pupil at a per pupil rate from the American Rescue Plan, from CRISA, and from the CARES Act, which totals, approximately $3,500 or so per pupil. And this is exceeds the combined ongoing funding between 2016-17 and 2017-18. So even without showing the ongoing funding that comes from the federal government in the current school year, you can see just the size of the investment again. Next slide, please. This shows the timeline for spending. So of all three of the funds, so the American Rescue Plan funds, you have until September 2024, so a several year horizon to invest these funds and really leverage them to accelerate learning among students. But something to keep in mind as you're planning for how you'll make investments over the course of the next few years. Next slide, please. And in California, this translates between state and federal funding to about $28 billion for accelerating student learning. So in addition to that federal funding, California passed AB 86. There was $2 billion there to support in-person instruction, and about $4.6 billion for learning recovery. That's the Expanded Learning Opportunity Grant. And these funds must be spent by August 31st, 2022, so after the end of next summer. And as you will see in the template, there's a plan that's due on June 1st. There are sort of 7 areas that are designated for use of these funds. And those include expanded learning, such as expanding the school day, expanding the school year, learning supports, a lot of which Heather touched on, providing that high dosage tutoring and intervention to support students. Integrated pupil supports, mental health supports, social emotional learning, all of those additional supports that we may see many students needing in the fall and currently. Support for community learning hubs around connectivity and other types of support. Support for credit deficient students to help them graduate, Additional academic services, this can be monitoring of funds and assessment, and then training for school staff. So really investing in building the capacity of our staff in the system. Your plan is based on your local needs. You don't have to address all 7 of these. So lots of flexibility here in the use of these funds to support students and staff in the system. Next slide, please. So this magnitude of funding presents a lot of opportunities and also some challenges. Just this moment presents tremendous challenges. So first, we know the needs in the system are great. And there's a need both for those short-term interventions, but also thinking longer term, the types of structural improvements that are needed in our systems. The plans are due soon. I mentioned June 1st. There's also an LCAP due in July. But there's also, in terms of the ELO grant, for example, and also likely planning around federal funds, there's flexibility to adjust your plans in the future. So although you're being asked to create a plan now, we will likely know more in the fall, both in terms of student need and also which types of supports for students are really working, and that can help guide future investments. One-time funding also presents a challenge. They really shouldn't be used for ongoing spending because with no end date, just because you can set yourself up for a fiscal cliff at the end. And there's a need for real communication with stakeholders about the time frame for use of these investments and when they will no longer be available. And that's particularly so given also the economic forecast is really uncertain at this time in terms of state funding. So we want to be able to invest with that uncertainty in mind as well. Next slide, please. This quote was from a parent from a training we did, and felt really important just to take note of this need that, even though, many of us in the system, I have twin 6-year-olds in kindergarten, are eager to get back to some kind of normal, it also is critical as we think about the return to school for some systems, just the way that we are ramping up the acceleration of learning for students, that normal just wasn't good enough for our lowest performing students. So how are we thinking about making the changes that are needed over time and in this moment to really support students in new and innovative ways? Next slide. So here are a few strategies. First, there's an opportunity to really streamline planning processes. This is critical because it both helps reduce the administrative burden, but also really important to ensure that there's alignment across plans. So as you think about rating and blending different funding sources, we want to make sure that the staff that are working on these plans are working together, and that there's alignment between the plans. Also, using stakeholder engagements for across plans as it's appropriate. There's also a real opportunity to build on existing improvement efforts. We imagine that a lot of the same students that have been identified for additional support in the past are also likely to need additional support now. Some of the strategies that you've already started that you're seeing that are working, you can double down on those strategies. So ensuring that there's some alignment between the existing improvement efforts and the plans that you're making now. Also important to really ensure that your investments are grounded in data. I know Heather has talked a lot about this, the need to assess students and really understand needs as we approach the new year. Next slide, please. Another important consideration for planning for the use of funds is how will you model the use of funds over time? So there will likely be a sort of ramp up period, a period of assessment, really understanding needs, constructing plans, and making some of those initial allocations. And then over time, you'll want to be measuring increases in capacity and learning acceleration, and then following a wind down plan. So all of that can be strategically planned in advance. You may find, this is presents sort of a normal curve, but you may have a big investment up front and more of a leveling off of investments. And just being really transparent with the community about what to expect in terms of investments, given this large federal increase, and then the availability of those funds going away in several years. Next slide, please. Another strategy for consideration is really to focus on what are the big issues in the district that you want to focus on. These bullet points are from Ed Week's survey of district leaders about their planned investments for the fall. And I think they present some nice ways of thinking about big bucket investments for districts to consider. And many of these are, I'm sure, are very familiar to you. Just to pull out one that I don't think we've talked about yet is we know that special education has been a really big issue as students have not had access in some cases to the same services or are waiting for assessments. So this is a really important area for us to attend to in the months that come, and especially as we have these additional investments to think about ways in which to improve services across these areas. Next slide. This slide shows the ways in which funds are flowing, not just to our education systems, but also through other agencies in the system that are serving our children. So flowing to Health and Human Services, through the Department of Agriculture. And really the point being here is that there is an increased investment across many agencies, and in order to best support our students, we need to make sure that we're not working in silos, that we're really leveraging all of the resources available and coordinating those services for students and families to really make the most impact and highest level practices and coordination of services for students. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier just the challenge of the use of one-time funds. I know many of you are already thinking about this. We know staff makes a really big difference for students. So how can we use one-time funds responsibly to support staff? So we call this adapting the cardinal rule of school finance, which is do not use one-time funds for ongoing expenses. So some strategies are to think about recruiting, retiring, or new teachers for out-of-school time tutoring. So we're providing some additional, again, this sort of high dosage support and academic support for students. It may also be social emotional well-being support, other types of support that students are needing in this moment. Also consider things like some systems are investing in micro grants to community organizations who can also provide that additional staffing and support for students and help sort of build some of that capacity around coordinating services for students with other community-based organizations, depending on the availability of those community-based organizations in your system and where you are geographically in the state. Next, there's an opportunity, even though these are one-time funds over the course of just a few years, to really think about how can we invest in a way that really considers sustainability in improvement for students over time. So one strategy is really to think about what are some investments we can make now that have longer-term payoffs. So we know that there's a lot of unmet need in infrastructure, in our buildings, in broadband connectivity, et cetera, devices. So there's a lot of investments that can be made there that really have longer term payoffs. The same is true for early interventions for students. when we get to students earlier and provide the types of supports they need, we know that there are payoffs later in their academic, in later grades. There's also an opportunity to invest in capacity building for everyone in the building, for teachers and staff and others in this moment. So a really, really opportune time for that over the next few years. And then also, as I mentioned before, this opportunity to build partnerships with other local child serving agencies, which sometimes, have some startup costs in establishing the infrastructure for those partnerships. So now is a time to invest in those types of partnerships that have payoffs for many years to come. Next slide, please. And the last point I want to make is just that there's an opportunity and a real importance to communicating the value of the funds from the federal government and the state, and to really measure and document and disseminate the good use of taxpayer resources. We can show how well school districts are using these funds in order to improve student learning, to support families and teachers and staff. So we know that there is a ongoing revenue issue in the state. So we want to show how well and what districts can do when we invest in our systems, in our education systems. And with that, I will turn it over. We're going to have an opportunity to hear the local perspective now, and starting with Dave Rivera from Orange Unified School District.
Thank you, Kelsey. I think you made some great points in your presentation, things that reverberate with us at the local level. So I'm going to cover for you some of the highlights of the things that we're doing as we're using these funds. I'm the Assistant Super of Business Services for the Orange Unified School District in Orange, in the County of Orange. And as you can see, we serve over 26,000 students on a daily basis. In our 7 areas, let me hit some highlights of things that we're doing here. We're going to have in the first category, we're going to have a summer school intervention camp for our elementary and middle school students. We've been collaborating with our business partners, which is Chapman University, Santiago Community College, along with a Irvine Chinese school for our dual immersion program. So we're going to have for the summer interventions, acceleration, and also enrichment opportunities. In the second category, we're going to continue with our use of learning recovery programs. We're going to have extensive PD for our certificated and classified staff. And then we're going to be adding paraprofessionals when possible. As we address the needs of the whole child, in the third category, we're looking at the addition of counselors, also contracting with companies that can assist us with PE, sports, and integrating our health into our health program. Under the fourth category, we're going to be looking at technology, so iPads and also laptops for our students. In the fifth category, we're looking to address the credit deficiency through the addition of additional sections for our high schools to provide interventions. And in the sixth category, we're looking at facilitating of iReady district-wide for diagnostic and progress monitoring, and also continuing with our staff development. I think the most important thing is, besides what you're doing, it's how do you do it? So we've been focused on the whole child aspect, and we've been focusing on thoughtful and communications with about providing the safest learning environment for our students and staff. We've been open up since September in offering a 5-day program. So our cabinet and extended cabinet have been meeting frequently and talking about the plans and how are we going to serve students in problem solving. So we're quite informed about each division's work. The work that we're doing is aligned with our LCAP and strategic plans. We have frequent newsletters that go out from the superintendent's office to our stakeholders, communicating information and status updates. Also, when we're looking at our facilities, many of our classrooms have been converted for offices or for other support providers. So we're looking at classroom utilization reports and facility needs to see how can we accommodate with the services that we need to provide. How are we going to best do that at our sites? Because at some sites we have limited capacity. We're going to be continuing our collaboration with our business partners, community, and employee groups. We have a very close working relationship with our associations. We respect that and treasure that and continue with the collaboration. And we do that by doing a number of stakeholder survey instruments that have gone out from our Ed Service Unit. So we have quite a bit of data that we've collected. And lastly, is that as you look at these funds, you will notice that there's some correlations with other grants. So we're actually looking at the last year of the grants, which at this point is 2024, and we're working backwards. So we're looking at it, where do we want to be in 2024, and then looking at how we can accomplish those goals and objectives. So in some cases, we have some expenditures that are going to be moved from one program to another because of the expiration dates. And I think that's going to be the key in the grant that we're talking about now, because it expires in 2022. So we actually have things that are going to be moving from other ESSER funds, other funding sources into this grant because of the timelines. Now our next presenter that's going to be joining us is Dr. Puglisi from Rio School District.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this morning. John Puglisi here, Superintendent Rio School District. We have over 5,000 students. We are situated just north of Los Angeles and south of Santa Barbara. And we've got 9 schools serving students preschool through 8th grade. If you'd like to go through to the next slide. Thank you. So that we try not to be too redundant, there were a few things that Heather mentioned in the very beginning that seemed to really be the backbone or the core content of a project that we've been working on for multiple years before COVID and afterwards. And that is on the expanded learning opportunities list called Literacy Support Team. The Literacy Support Team is a group of classified employees, aspiring teachers, community members, also supported by a software company partner learning priority that we have. And what we were doing was really what Heather was trying to outline we all should be doing following this pandemic. And that is reimagine, reiterate, and really restore a healthy learning environments and healthy relationships for students. Some students before didn't have the 3 things that we're aiming for in the literacy support team, and that is really being connected, being engaged to learn, and then being involved, seeing themselves, goal setting in the actual improvement of their learning over the time. The literacy support team is really a developing entity that has shifted and adapted to COVID-19 and really hits a lot of the key components of this webinar this evening. Some that I would add to it is that we focus or emphasize is that we really focus on what's the role in the human, what's the role of the computer, and how do those human-computer human dynamics really serve to help every student be connected, particularly the ones who haven't been, for them to be engaged to learn and to be part of their cognizance, their improved learning over time. And that's really about building relationships with children, not only just adult-child relationships, but relationships with them as learners. And in particularly in our district, we really need to focus on literacies and on reading. One of the things that was mentioned before also was this notion of how often and in what ways does do these extra supports come for different students? Really, maybe rather than using the word dosage, we think about depth, quality, and frequency. So how often, matching that with what the students need and what families need and want, and then demonstrating evaluatively how that progress or achieving goals. So for one example is we've used this in the past before COVID to really help make sure that students continue to read and don't have what some people call reading loss over time. I think we've shared with you a little video that goes in greater depth, and it's a pleasure being here this evening. Feel free to watch the video or contact our school district for anything else that you would like to learn more. And next we have Paul Wallace, trustee from Newman Crows Landing School District.
Thank you so much, John. And Heather and Kelsey did a really neat job of covering an awful lot. Oh, next slide, please. Heather and Kelsey did a really neat job. I'm not going to go super in depth, but this tells you who we are and gives you some thoughtful ideas. You'll all have the slide deck if you want to look at it later. I'm going to grab just a few things. We heard a lot about streamlining what we're doing with our planning and whatnot. Let your LCAP be your guide. That was real obvious for us. You kind of done this same work. I'm going to skip individualizing because Heather did a really nice job of talking about assessment. Under mental health stuff, one of the things that we're adding now is trauma-informed skills, and really that's the idea is that every adult in our district will have training in how to recognize a student that's in crisis. And so, you know, that's just a way to think about it. Other thing in mental health is we're looking at the families as well. We're doing some work with parent outreach stuff, but that creates a dilemma that everybody's going to have to answer. And this gets back to the governance and boardship. How much do you devote resources to mental health and student support and take that out of academic work? So that's something that you have to really look at your district and think about where you belong. The late bus is one that, you know, huge equity improvement when we can let kids that have to ride the bus get home after having these after school things. New programs is a piece of what we talk about. Don't forget that we had a program sitting on the shelf, and it was happened to be a phonics program, but we never implemented it because we went to this, you know, distance learning, and it wasn't functional for us. So think about stuff you may already have on the shelf that you can just go ahead and get started with. Key interesting thing about a professional development, some of our professional development is going to be teachers and classified staff in the same professional development, receiving the same help. And I thought that was kind of an interesting option. And what I will close with is my comment about honoring your staff. We've got kind of a huge wad of money that's come and rolling at us. I think that the state and federal officials that gave us this money expected additional work for it. We know the kids need extra help. They've been in school for a year, but they didn't get everything that they needed. We need something to kick that up and help these kids recover. And now as a school district, I felt like we were faced with, how are we going to do this? Are we going to go to some outside contractor? Are we going to purchase things? And we did some of that, but we came back to the realization that we need to honor our staff, and we need to spend this money with our staff. And that does not mean going onto the salary schedule with it, where you're going to be laying people off or cutting wages in 2 years. But it does mean things like paying your teachers to come back and tutor after class. It means things like increasing our aides to have, you know, full 6-hour days, whereas maybe they had 4s before or something. So and I feel like if you don't hold that ethical standard of, these are our partners, we've got this money, if we can achieve our goals and get this extra work done, let's do it through the folks that we came with. And ultimately, at some point, I think that if you don't do that, you will face it at the bargaining table, and you're going to have your bargaining units ask for this to be added to the wage and column schedules. So I encourage you to think about that. And that really gets to these governance kind of questions. What can the school board do as opposed to what the administration can do? And we can set standards like, hey, listen, we want to honor our staff. We think that the mental health we need is maybe crisis stuff, or we think the mental health that we need is ongoing support. And I think that that's something that the governance team, the superintendent and the board can really collaborate together on. So with that, I would like to toss it to Robert Garcia from Jurupa Valley.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Heather and Kelsey, for very detailed, very great presentations. And thank you to CSBA for having this webinar. And I've got 4 points I want to really touch on: technology, professional development, relationships, and LEAP. First, technology is something that we've taken very serious here in Jurupa since 2015, where we made sure every student from grades 3 to 12 had a Chromebook. And we also did infrastructure updates, and really helped us during this pandemic because we were able to not only our students were ready to go, but it also offered us the opportunity to focus more on the students that maybe the lowest, as I think Kelsey mentioned, the folks that need the most resources, like they don't have internet at home. So it allowed us to go straight to focus on that. So that was a good thing for us. Second, professional development is probably a very important thing. I'm a big fan of baseball, and so I'm a big fan of the Braves. In the 90s, the Braves were one of the most dominant teams, and they still are. And the reason is because they build their own bench, and so they have their own farm system. It doesn't mean that they don't bring outside talent in, they do, but it's their system. And so we have a similar approach here in Jurupa. Not that we consulted with the Braves, but it is a similar approach where we, back in 2019, we started a leadership academy where we can train our staff, both certificated and classified, for leadership roles. And that last year, I think we hired 3 people internally through those that development program. So very good program. And I think it's important that you, because those internal employees are vested in your district. And so it's important that they understand the culture. And so, and again, during COVID, it really helped us to manage the situation and be able to get on with implementing these strategies. Relationships, obviously relationships are very important in life, in business, same thing in the district in Jurupa. And when we went to, we closed schools back in August last year. So we made sure we communicate with all our stakeholders, especially our employee associations, because we wanted to enhance that collaboration and kept them in the loop the whole time. So that's really important because we're able to all look at the data, and you hear all types of things coming at you from community members, parents, teachers, but we really focus on the data, and having a good relationship with our employee groups really helped us to do that. And of course, communication and transparency. So these things really pay off. So, and finally, the final topic I just wanted to give you a brief description on is called LEAP. And this is this is Jurupa's reimagining and rebuilding strategy, if you will. And it stands for Learning Engages All Possibilities. So our team here in Jurupa did a lot of research on how to respond to the pandemic. Of course, we need to start with social and emotional learning and get teacher buy-in. So we give teachers the ability to choose a passion project for them that would be fun, engaging for the students, because we want to be able to engage them. It's not just about academics right up front. We got to get them back into school and get them engaged. So they came up with this catchy little phrase that I really like, LEAP. So I also just want to touch real quick on this. We are offering summer school for our students this year. K through 12. It's been 10 years since we've offered it to anybody besides high school. That's also going to help us as part of this LEAP program to get our kids back to in-person and feeling good about getting back to learning. And as some of the other folks have mentioned, we have a parent involvement community outreach program where we're serving the whole child, and mental health is so important. And the last point I want to make is, and I think Heather may mention this, academic acceleration versus remediation. So taking that scaffolding approach just to bring, it's not about learning loss that you may hear about, but more about an opportunity to fill the academic gaps. So those are some of the things we're doing in Harupa. And thank you for joining today and for your commitment and dedication to all our students. And I wish you all the best. And now I'm going to introduce, sorry, Jeff. So next we got Jeff from Dell North.
Hey, thanks, Robert. So again, I just want to thank all my colleagues for joining in today. Thank everybody who's online, because what we're talking about is it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to engage our students, engage our staff, engage our communities in a very different way. So up here in Del Norte, for those of you who aren't familiar with our county and our district, we're a single district county. We're the northwesternmost county in California. We border Oregon and we're on the Pacific Ocean. In our particular universe and in our ecosystem, we're pretty isolated. So going back to what some of my colleagues had said about kind of developing our own internal programs and looking at our own needs, we really are focusing on how do we develop programs utilizing these, again, one-time funds to really engage our students and our community in a way that we haven't done before, bring families into the mix, and then look at how to create sustainable opportunities. Because I think the one thing that none of us can lose in this conversation is after a year or two or three, after the ESSER funds and the ELO funds and everything else are spent down, we will have created some expectations within our communities, within our districts and our counties, of services that people will want to see continued. So, we do have to think about that. So my school board, a great group of people, came up with a very simple mission statement, and that's equipping students for success. So in taking a look at that mission that our boards adopted and said, okay, what does this look like using some of this expanded learning opportunity structure? We really talked about in the short and the long term. So in the short term, this summer, we're putting together something that's called a summer of fun. We're rethinking our summer program, kind of like Robert said. We've done minimal summer school. This year, we are offering summer school that ostensibly could reach out to at least half of our student body throughout the county. And these are highly engaging academic programs, but I want to focus on highly engaging. Yes, we're all statewide going to be looking at academics, but one of the issues that we have is we are a geographically large school district, and it is very difficult in engaging all of our students comprehensively through multiple communities. So we're focusing on everything field trip based writing classes to science-based math classes to environmentally based reading classes. There's just a whole variety of things that are coming up as part of this, with the intent that we're scaffolding learning to prepare students for re-entering school in the fall of this year. And that's just one example of short term. On the longer term front, I think our board has been extremely cognizant of not only the academics, and again, my colleagues did such a good job talking about that. I want to focus really on what we're looking at with the social emotional learning. It is equipping students with what they need, right? So we know that to learn effectively, we need to have healthy classrooms. We need to have healthy schools. We need to have a healthy community. And the last 12 months have created a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of disconnect. And so our goal over the next months and few years is really to expand our counseling services, extend services to families and extend services out into the community. One example of that, we have a relatively new website called Connect Dell North. And what we've done is we've gone out to all of our partners and we've looked at what the needs of our community are and how we can really connect our community to things like housing and healthcare and jobs and social emotional supports, and create a non-branded way through the schools that can engage our families in getting what they need to have healthy homes and help us create healthy students. You've heard the word over and over again, relationship. One of the largest effect sizes for really engaging students and increasing academic achievement, increasing all those quality indicators of school is relationships with the teachers in the classroom. And so rebuilding relationships in schools, bringing kids in a way that they're understanding and that they don't feel like they're being taught down to. And I think that you've heard it mentioned a couple times, this coming year can't be about remediation. It really needs to be about intervention to the extent that you need it, but really about acceleration through that spiraling process. And it really is about looking at the data and determining what students need. Because another cautionary piece, one of the things as we look at the social emotional needs of students and we talk about building relationships, those items have huge opportunities to help our students gain traction and to move forward. One of the largest detractors to student success, it actually will have a negative effect on student success to the same extent that positive relationships do, is if students are bored. So really taking a look at those high interest, academically appropriate programs that are potentially sustainable, that really involve that classroom interaction. And here again, remember, we're talking classified and certificated staff. These are all of the things that our expanded learning opportunities funds are going to support. And you can see the list that I have on the slide there. But you know, we're trying to avoid the idea of there is a silver bullet. You know, we've heard a lot of folks say that we're going to go with this program or that program, or we're going to do whatever. The key that my board believes and that I believe is going to help our students succeed to the greatest extent is investing internally. It's flexing our learning opportunities. It's rethinking school. It's rethinking special education. It's rethinking high school structures. It is eliminating barriers that we've had for decades in public schools, and thinking about how do we really and truly dig down to give each student what they need to succeed. Like my board said, how are we equipping them for success? So I think that's all I have. So, you know, at this point, we'll open up Q&A and I'll hand it back to Mary.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate that, and all of the presenters that have shared so far. If I can have our esteemed panelists rejoin us on camera. We were going to start tackling some of the questions that we have. So as I mentioned at the outset, as folks registered for our webinar, they had an opportunity to submit questions. And you have several questions have come in over the course of the webinar. And so we're going to kind of tackle them. And I think the first question that I'd like to start with is really kind of the focus of the webinar overall. We talked about governance in the role of developing effective learning plans. And someone submitted the question, they really want to know what are the specifics of what they as a board member can do. kinds of questions that they might ask of staff or things to look for. So we've seen little bits integrated throughout your presentations, but I think we'll start with Paul and Robert, our two trustees on the panel, and then we have some thoughts from our other panelists. So Paul, if you want to take that question, because I know we have a lot of board members who want to hear that.
And I totally share the frustration. You come in as a board member and you hear a presentation about how to decorate your classroom, and I'm like, I have no place deciding how to decorate a classroom. That's not the governance role. And so yeah, let's tear this back and think about what is the governance role from the board side, and how do we collaborate with our superintendents and our staff and our administrators. One of the first things that I think you really need to do, and by the way, I'm going to kind of handle this as a twofer. I know that Robert has some thoughts on the superintendent stuff too, but I am also going to kind of cover a couple of the superintendent questions where they coincide. One of the big things that a board can do is set that overall decision and look back and ask, what's our district short on, what's our district long on, and then come to your superintendents and say, hey, listen, I think that this is where our problems are. We don't have enough attendance, or I'm not sure that our staff is covering things with fidelity, or gosh, I trust my staff, everything's going along great. I want to know that the kids are making improvement. So you start off by thinking about what's our district strengths and weaknesses, what are we concerned about, and then ask to collaborate on what's a measure that measures that. If you come back and you think, gosh, I trust my staff, I think they're doing a great job, I think that we're coming up with a good idea, and they say, well, let's keep track of how many kids attend. You might say, gosh, let's step the rigor of that up a little bit, and let's come up with what could we do to measure how students are improving. Which in our district, we know that writing and reading are things that really got hampered by. So now maybe we want to talk about, how are you guys going to let us know that at the end of this project, writing and reading have improved? And then that's a collaboration point. You get to a superintendent and say, what information is available? What would measure this? So goals and measures are a real big, talked a little bit about it with setting your standard and the ethical standards you have dealing with your labor unions on spending this money, but also, ethical standards and, what is important. I have a dilemma going on with me. We're spending a lot of time and effort doing a lot of social, emotional, and mental health stuff. It's vital and important. Is it the school's role? And how much are we taking out of our academic efforts to make sure that these kids are good and safe? And can we address all the good and safety that these kids need? Because, we can't necessarily take care of the fact that, one parent's beating the other parent up at night, but we know that that child's not going to perform up to her abilities. Couple of things on the superintendent question, as long as we're at it. You're hiring a new superintendent. How does this tie to it? It's that same thing. The board needs to assess where you are. Are you broken? Do you need to be fixed? Or do you have a pretty good system going? You need somebody to come in and keep it up. So I think the big deal is the board needs to decide where we are and what we need to be doing. And then that really flows to what that new superintendent is going to do, and what kind of questions. We're in the midst of this process right now. We have an offer out to somebody. We're hoping to ratify their contract at our next meeting. And so we just went kind of through this. But I will throw out a tidbit that I think can be a big help to boards. If you're going to use an interim superintendent, think about giving them some assignments. Very often an interim superintendent comes in, opens a mail and says, what do you want to do? But these are skilled people that come with a lot of background. And something that we did in the past when we did need to use an interim superintendent was we said, gosh, we think maybe there's a personnel issue with somebody. We want you to solve it. Figure it out. At the end of your interimness, be able to tell us you have a problem, you don't have a problem. If you have a problem, maybe even get rid of that person prior to the new superintendent coming on, and then the new superintendent gets to hire their staff without being the bad guy. the other one was, at that time, we had a problem. We thought that our special ed was not being administered properly. And we said, hey, listen, come in, figure it out, be the bad guy who comes in and says, your special ed program isn't up to state standards. Be the guy that says that. The new superintendent can come in and fix it without having to be the bad guy that says, hey, this is broken and there's no kind of shooting match between he and the other. So thank you. That was what I have. And I know that Robert has some thoughts on these as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you,
Yes.
Mary. So I'll go ahead and address the question, at least the first question. We can come back to that other one later. So the role of a board, I think at this time, I think it's important that we not to lose focus. So there's a plan in place, let's say back in August, and we continue to monitor all the health and COVID cases, those types of things. And we just keep an eye on that. We work with our member groups and make data-driven decisions. And then we ensure effective communication with all of our stakeholders. So I think that's probably, I think for the board members out there, to add to what Paul had mentioned, just to make sure that you're a team player and you got to stick to what your plan is and not listen to all the chatter coming in, because it's really important that we focus on our students.
Yeah, thank you. So do any of our superintendents or research colleagues on the panel want to think about the board role? Any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in, Mary, thanks. I just want to echo and underline really quickly a little bit of what Paul said around the questions that you can ask. All of these funds have an incredible amount of flexibility associated with them, which is fantastic, but it also means that there will be proposals on the table for spending that wouldn't actually have a clear connection to student outcomes or serving students. And so I think making that connection really transparent for every line item, for every investment. What do we expect to happen as a result of this investment? How does this help students and families recover from this pandemic? And I think one of the speakers said it really well. The expectation from this money is that it's for more, it's for different, it's for recovery. And so using this for things that are perhaps not for more work for recovery, there might be demands to do that. For example, we've heard some proposals around paying teachers stipends for extra work during the pandemic, which, teachers have been working incredibly hard. That is true. But then also, how does that help us with recovery looking forward? So just being kind of relentless on asking about expected outcomes would be my advice.
Thank you, Heather.
And if you don't mind, I'll just kick in too. I think if the board sets a clear written, communicated expectations in like Paul and Robert were talking about, what are the outcomes of these initiatives? Don't go to the touchy-feely, we all kind of like it. We need to have clear expected outcomes for students, for staff, and for the benefit of our entire educational system. And I think that starts with the board being able to communicate that clearly.
Thank you. Jeff, Kelsey, it looked like you had something you'd like to add.
Yeah, I would just add that, based on the data we're collecting and progress monitoring, asking about revisiting the plans and making sure that the plans are still covering the types of investments that are working best for students. And as we think about really, reinventing and making schools work better for kids, asking, who is helping us define the needs in our system, and also who is helping us to define the solution. So I think there's some probing that can be done around how we are engaging our community in helping us to drive towards better systems also.
And that actually leads perfectly into the next question. So Kelsey, it's like I paid you to be the ringer in the panel. We do have a lot of questions around the stakeholder engagement piece. The timeline in developing these plans is really tight, with a June 1st deadline for the AB 86 extended learning opportunity grants. And in the template that districts will be submitting and counties will be submitting, includes a section on how you engaged with stakeholders and how that had an impact on your plan. So I'm wondering if there are any thoughts about ways that get at stakeholder engagement that perhaps are a little outside of the box, maybe something a little different than a survey. Any practices that folks would like to share with those on the line?
Mary, I can jump in with a research-based perspective. A team of researchers that's working with PACE has been studying stakeholder engagement in a number of California school districts during the pandemic, and those results and insights will be coming out later this summer. But one of the things that I think is really important to raise up is that real authentic stakeholder engagement isn't about what's shot out from the district, but really about what's gotten back from the community. So some of the best examples of this are, when districts say we weren't getting the groups that we really wanted to hear from to respond. So we had teams that went to people's houses and met in the street, masked outside, or just getting really creative, and that kind of necessary engagement being front and center rather than, I think we've heard of other districts who maybe sent out surveys or sent out information, but it's much more one directional. So really not stopping until you hear the voice of the people specifically that aren't the ones who fill out a survey or raise their hands or are the first to give you their thoughts.
Yeah, this is John too. I would just add to that couple of phenomena that probably many districts have experienced is that some things that maybe we've thought about doing or we've done less in the past, we've been able to do more. And Zoom meetings and people attending meetings has gone through the roof in Rio. We have many people. So engaging not only in face-to-face and being flexible and diverse, home visits have also increased. You mentioned that just for other purposes other than talking. So on many levels for various purposes. Another tool that we've used is a software program that comes out of Canada called Thought Exchange, and it moves a little bit beyond your typical survey. It allows the people who are engaged to both produce and put ideas, their thoughts, but they can then look and like and see visuals and see how their thoughts align with other folks. So flexibility, diversity, and innovation. So some of the things that have come out of this very difficult time are things that I hope we are able to continue on and sustain, and that is more non-traditional stakeholder engagement.
I thank you all for that perspective. And I think something that Kelsey mentioned earlier about being able to go back and revisit plans, even though you have a deadline on a template for June 1st, and you have your LCAP stakeholder engagement that has a timeline before we hit July, so like end of June. It doesn't mean that we can't really bring the families and other stakeholders into the conversations when we are back in the fall. And so I think, something that we think of as an ongoing process, and that's part of the relationship building that Heather talked about as well. It's not just the formal meetings, but the other ways that you're engaging with families and identifying needs. So there's another question that I think is on a lot of board members' minds, and I heard it in a few presentations, but someone submitted the question about how you might be, as a board, managing expectations of stakeholders about using one-time funding. So what are some ways that you might help manage those expectations?
Well, I'd like to chime in on that issue. So one of the directors that was one of my mentors shared with me a long time ago that a CBO only has a problem under two conditions: when there's no money or when there is money. So the challenge that we have in front of us is that we had a problem to begin with declining enrollment, and it was labeled as a silent recession. So we've all been struggling with enrollment declines, in some areas more than others. I've been here in Southern California for the last 20 years. I've been in districts with enrollment decline. So the challenge, we had a problem to begin with, and we had some systemic issues to begin with. In my district, we have half our schools that have high unduplicated pupil counts, but because we have also, we're a diverse district, we also have half our district with more affluent. So our unduplicated pupil count's 50%. So we don't receive concentration grant funds. So we really have to manage it with our internal base funding and supplemental grants. So the problem is you got to tell your story. And I think this is the best opportunity that we have in my career, that we actually, I believe, have a sincere interest in providing funding for education, investments in education, both at the state and federal level. And I think we need to communicate what our needs are, and then how we're going to best fill these needs in the interim. But then after this funding goes away, what is going to be the challenge for us? So we're really trying to build a bridge to get us to the end of the funding, the funding scheme. And then after that, how are we going to sustain that moving forward? And I think having those honest conversations, not only with our board, but also the community, so that way they understand what challenges that we're dealing with. And the fact that, many of us, if you look at the state, our funding is so far less than many other states. The last time I looked at the Census Bureau, they showed that California average for funding per student, that we were $7 ahead of Nebraska. Well, the cost of living here is much different than it is in Nebraska. So I think we need to tell our story. And I think also this is the best opportunity that we have to show how public education can shine and how we can make a difference. So I think we need to take this opportunity afforded to us by COVID into, this is our finest hour. And how do we, communicate that? And I think we communicate that by the facts. We tell our story one chapter at a time. And it's going to be different for each one of us, because depending on where we're at with our funding and how long we've been open and how those funds have been used. But I think we have an ability here to communicate and to show the leadership that is necessary and inform our audience.
Mary, if I can jump in real quick, just from a board member's perspective, my own perspective, for board members out there, it's really important that you trust your staff and you find you have those good relationships as well with the superintendent, CBO, and so that you can see the whole plan. And I would say ask as many questions as you can about these types of one-time funding, but also school board members, we're not experts, certainly would never have all the answers, but it's really important to have that level of trust with staff.
Thank you. So one of the questions that we've been talking about throughout this webinar is this concept of re-engagement. So many students and families struggle to remain engaged during distance learning, and in fact, chronic absenteeism is up significantly. The number of students missing 10% or more of the school year. We had a question about some best practices that we can use as we plan for the coming school year and ahead. We've heard a lot about summer learning and really engaging lessons. Anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, this is John again. I think mentioned earlier in Heather's presentation was how we help students and families, and for that matter, sometimes teachers and employees, readapt and re-engage. We in Rio drew from a lot of our colleagues who have been heading in this direction before COVID. We call it Smart Start. So there's a bunch of research on Smart Start and what a Smart Start is. A lot of it is focused particularly in middle school or when students move from one grade level, one building to another, to a high school. So that idea that students enter into culture, and just like in real estate, it's location, location, location. A lot of research will say that schools are about culture, culture, culture. So helping students make the connections, enter into any new dynamic, build relationships with their peers, their adults. Again, connecting what we were talking about in the literacy support team, seeing themselves as learners and co-learners. And I would say that Smart Start idea, we had a lot of positive feedback by everybody. Of course, we want to get to the academics as soon as possible, and we think Smart Start includes academics and engaging learning right from the beginning, but it's how we approach it and how we enter in, and many times it's the things that we don't do. Another thing I heard Heather talk about, which is really important, that you do assessments, you gather data with kids authentically as much as possible, and only gather it with the stuff that you're going to use. So again, all of us have had these experiences of transitioning from one thing to another, and each community might be a little different, but maybe you might want to go out there and think about this idea of Smart Start and what that means. When students are connected and they're purposed, then they'll engage and start improving their learning.
And I'd like to just build really quickly onto what John said. In the same way that we're thinking about tiered strategies for supporting learning, I think tiered strategies for supporting re-engagement are also really important. There are going to be some kids who still don't want to come back or who don't come back regularly because all of those norms have been disrupted. And their reasons for that are going to be really different. And when you look at the research around attendance and chronic absenteeism, sometimes it's that there isn't a culture of attendance within families and communities. And so maybe information and texting and things like that will help. But sometimes it's because students don't have transportation, or they don't have clean clothes, or they don't have any social relationships established at school. And so really understanding why they're not coming to school can help with creating deliberate strategies for getting them there. But it is really high touch work that often does go beyond what we kind of typically think of as the work of schools.
And Heather, I just wanted to add one thing, because I know you're going to shut up because you just sparked something. Some of the same kids who were disconnected before, they're easy, we've identified it and we know, but one thing that we learned, particularly those of us who are parents, or like I have a superintendent's roundtable with kids, and there are kids who were disconnected who weren't the disconnected kids there before. So knowing and listening to them, that was another thing I was going to say before. Kids will tell you a lot. So I hope the kids' voices are in the development of these plans in real ways. Our superintendent's roundtable kids told me one of the reasons why they're disconnected, they're distracted. They were distracted, and I had them break that down, what the distracted was. And some very, deep emotional things. Other kids will say, well, I was just pursuing my hobbies and I just forgot to click on things. So disconnected can come in many different ways, some for good reasons, but I really like that. Differentiate your understanding just as much as the work that you're going to do.
Thank you. And so I think at this point, we're kind of ready to wrap up. There are some questions that we were not able to get to, and I want to let you know that we will work on the back end to get responses out for you. But if you want to advance the slide for a moment. There are some additional ways that you can access some of CSBA's resources around this. Prior webinars, including the one around summer learning, I saw a question come in about challenges with staffing summer learning. That was covered really extensively in our webinar last week. You can find those, and soon you'll be able to find this webinar on CSBA's YouTube channel, which is linked here. We also have some information about summer learning on our website. But we will be sending a copy out to anyone who registered for this webinar of the recording of this webinar, as well as a slide deck. And as Heather mentioned earlier, there are some additional resources kind of tacked onto the slide deck that you might want to look at. They're kind of like a bonus gift, things that maybe you can look at once you've had a chance to process all of this information. And it also includes a link to a video about the literacy support teams that John shared earlier. So we want to thank our panelists once again, John, Robert, Paul, Kelsey, Jeff, Dave, and Heather. Really appreciate everything that you brought to this conversation, and wishing everyone out in the audience a very successful end to the school year, and you know, an opportunity to restore for yourselves so that you can head into the new year to support our students. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.